friendly. We feel a little bit on the spotlight. But just to say, we really appreciate the opportunity. We understand this is the honourable members' oversight visit, and to be able to have an opportunity as the Broadcasting Industry Association to just share some of the developments in the sector is really a wonderful opportunity, and I want to thank you for that. Our chairperson and deputy chairperson of the NAB, that's Nick Grubb and Philly Mwelwa, regrettably couldn't be with us today, but I'm very pleased to be joined today with our Commercial Radio Committee chairperson, Tawana and Cheke, as well as our Commercial TV Committee expert, Ainan Doyle, and our Legal and Regulatory Affairs, Julia Sham, and also joined with us today is our Research and Comms Specialist, Afense Mbweni, who's sitting somewhere in the audience. And we are also joined today by the Broadcast Research Council CEO, Gary Whittaker, who will take us through some of the research issues a little later. I know that, honourable members, we did present to you during your induction last year, but for those members who are joining us today who might not know who we are, I thought I'll just do a quick overview. So we are an organisation that... Are we right? We are an organisation that was formed 31 years ago. We represent the regulated broadcasting sector. We represent all three tiers, so the public broadcaster is one of the founding members, in fact, of the NAB. We represent all the TV broadcasters, commercial broadcasters, a small number of community broadcasters, as well as signal providers. We are a voluntary association, which means that we're funded totally by our members, and we're a totally consensus-driven organization. So when colleagues ask us for a position or a view, those views and those positions are mandated views and positions from the collective membership. They're principled positions, and they're never individual views. Members, you may be aware that we also established the BCCSA over 31 years ago, and the BCCSA is recognized through the ECA Section 54 provisions. We've been at the forefront of representing the broadcasting industry in a whole range of policy and regulatory matters, but also more recently around promoting and supporting traditional broadcasting. I think you've heard what Colin Mashelier from the DCDT just mentioned around the impact of digital disruption on all our industries and all our sectors. And as traditional, what some people call legacy broadcasters, we have a vital role to play in terms of providing consistent, ethical, credible news, information, because all our broadcasters who are licensed, and it's so lovely to see CASA's chairperson here as well, all our licensed broadcasters have to adhere to a code of conduct for broadcasting. As I said, the members are wide-ranging, just some of the names up on the screen, and our mission is really to advance the interests of the sector. We've done, over the years, thousands of written submissions. We also play a role in putting forward nominations when vacancies arise at ICASA, the MDDA, the BBBEE ICT Sector Council, MICT-CETA, etc. And our job is really to keep our members abreast of developments and changes in the environment. We conduct specialized research, and I think that we forget we're now in year 5, having experienced one of the most devastating pandemics we've ever experienced. During the COVID period, our members played a vital role in terms of keeping all citizens informed and updated around developments. A few of our activities, we've been trialing digital audio broadcasting with Sadiba. We do a lot of skills development and capacity building. We run seminars, webinars. We launched last year the NAB Women's Forum. We also run a free radio initiative where we take on board key societal issues and concerns, and public service announcements are developed around those. We did one even before the lockdown period around gender-based violence. During COVID, we did quite a number of PSAs as well. And so that's just some of the initiatives that we run. We obviously support community broadcasting, always have. Our members contribute to the MDDA fund, contributing almost 65% of the total funding arrangement that the MDDA has. We've developed a future-proofing document for the community sector. We also did some training with NAMISA and the MDDA in that regard. And when we turned 30 in 2023, we developed a short booklet that really looked at community broadcasting between the years 1993 to 2023, and you can find all those documents on our website. We're part of also local and global initiatives. We obviously work very closely with the Broadcast Research Council. We are also part of the global movements around the promotion of traditional media, so we're part of the World Radio Alliance and the Global TV Group, and we're very passionate about promoting traditional television and radio. I'm going to hand over to Ainan Doyle, who's going to talk to some key issues around our sector, and then we'll go into just the highlights of our research that we did just recently, where we use PwC as our independent provider who ran a survey of our members, and today we'll be sharing some of the research outputs. But I'm going to hand over to Ainan Doyle now.
Thank you. Good morning, honoured members and other parties in the audience. I think, I'm speaking always really from the perspective of television, and I was born in 1969, which was the same year that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And an interesting factoid about that was that while the entire rest of the world watched the Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, South Africa didn't, because the then government was concerned about television, and they didn't allow it to enter into South Africa because they were worried about what impact it would have on the values and the culture at that time. So it was only when I was 7 years old that we had, in 1976, the first television broadcasts. And I think that highlights one of the strong concerns which led to the framework we have today, is that in the lead up to the negotiations for our first democracy, parties in exile, organizations in exile, creatives in exile, all met in the Netherlands for a key event, the Jabulani Freedom of the Airwaves Conference. And it was at that event, with other parties from South Africa, including the SABC, members of the SABC were there as well, it was decided that never again should it be allowed in our democracy that a government could so control the message, the medium, to the people. And that was then taken into our constitution. We have section 16, the freedom of expression, the freedom of creativity, that it cannot be constrained. And then secondly, and perhaps most importantly for the regulatory environment, is section 192 of the Constitution, which falls in the chapter that deals with the institutions that support democracy. So 192 in essence says that the regulation of broadcasting should be done by an independent body. Unlike all the other institutions in that chapter of the Constitution, it's not specified who that body is. It's left up to you as Parliament to determine who will be responsible for the regulation of broadcasting. So what we had was that the framework had to be revamped and needed a policy, and that policy was in 1998. The then ANC government put in place a white paper for broadcasting, which stipulated a number of things. The tiers, which we know today, public broadcasting, commercial broadcasting, community broadcasting, the importance of them. It even at that stage, believe it or not, highlighted that our future would also be multi-channel digital broadcasting, and it gave some guidance on how we as a country would need to address that, moving into the new technologies. That policy set the framework for the very next year, 1999, the Broadcasting Act, and also to give voice to 192, we had the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the IBA Act, which was the independent body contemplated in 192. And their first job that they did was to put in place the Triple Inquiry Report, which set all the basis of how we were going to take these three tiers, which had been put out in policy and then created in terms of the licensing framework. How were they going to then give voice to the legislation? And then, as we know, time does not stand still. It moves on. Technologies change. And we started to see convergence taking place. And at that point in our history, we then had the Convergence Bill, which led to the Electronic Communications Act of 2005. Perhaps what's important to note then is that there was no new policy on broadcasting, and so everything in the Broadcasting Act that related to the licensing framework was then ported across as is into Chapter 9 of the Electronic Communications Act. So it wasn't revised. But the rest of the licensing framework as it applied to the telecommunications sector, that was updated. And I think that's quite an important point, is that along the road we have seen various times when the policy on telecommunications has been updated. The most recent being a few years ago when we had the National Integrated ICT Policy Framework. But broadcasting itself is still, in terms of a policy framework, still guided by, not actually, I should say, it's not really guided, because you can't really guide a whole industry by something that's put out in 1998. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we face as a country, is that there has been no real updating for our policy framework. And we're moving to the next slide. Thank you. I think one of the things that we can see is that whether it's the SABC or it's the commercial broadcasters or it's the community broadcasting sector, we have all contributed to the cultural fabric of this country, to the creative fabric of this country, moving from a single broadcaster in the prior framework to really a multifaceted broadcasting sector that has created jobs and has informed, educated and entertained the public. Some of the constraints that we face is that we have, as I mentioned previously, the outdated policy framework. There has been attempts, the most recent being in 2020 with the publication of the draft white paper on audiovisual content services, which was then later updated to also include some elements of online safety. But once again, I think from our perspective as broadcasters, a concern would be that was 5 years ago. We still don't have a final policy. It probably needs to be rejuvenated. And then we have other challenges. Load shedding. It's been with us for long enough that most broadcasters have put in place mitigating generators, solar power at a number of the transmitter sites, but we can't assist the public who in many cases are unable to keep their TV sets on. So there's an impact also on our sector from load shedding in the sense that audience will dip in and out depending on if the area they're in has been load shedded and they don't have battery supply or any other way to have power for their devices, whether it be television or radio. So I think as we move to the following slide is just to highlight very quickly the dramatic change we've had just as far back as 2010. 2010, the only competition that the broadcasters really had from online was YouTube. By 2015, you can see how we've shifted from just the broadcasters and YouTube to advertising video on demand, subscription video on demand, OTT sports, and when we get to just last year, you can see the competition that is in our sector, competing directly with the broadcasters and yet essentially unregulated because they don't have a licensing framework to keep to, they don't have local content obligations to maintain. The most that they have to do is go to the Film and Publications Board and register in terms of, and that is only in respect of some of them, being the wholesale video distributors, register there to keep to a code as well as to use the FPB's logos and so forth when it comes to the various age restrictions. I'll hand back over to Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you, Aidan. I think it's important for us to always contextualize where we are. And honourable members of Parliament, you're very lucky today because in this room are people who actually have walked through this journey since 1994. I see Dimitri Martinez sitting on the right there. We were regulators together. Myself and Aidan were regulators together. We were people who worked at the Independent Broadcasting Authority at the time, granted the first licenses, set the first policy frameworks, licensing conditions, etc. Into ICASA. It's lovely that Vuyabati, who's also been a councillor, is on the SABC board. You are so fortunate that, you know, we are so fortunate that we have incredible expertise in the room, outside the room, and I think what we're wanting to also share today is that there is a great amount of support for the committee. There's a great interest to assist and to support the committee wherever we can. So the State of the Industry report, the NAB does this report almost every 4 years. Our previous 2 iterations you'll find online. It really is a report where we have PwC doing a survey, an independent questionnaire goes to our members, very confidentially done, and we look at a few key indicators in terms of how our sector is progressing. So what we actually looked at this year, we looked at content, specifically local content, independent production, etc. We looked at revenues, that's advertising, as well as the contributions the sector makes in the form of corporate and employee taxes, license fees, etc. Employment levels, levels of investment, social contributions, ownership, of course the huge COVID impact, load shedding impact that Ainan's just pointed to and that we're all experiencing over this week and going forward, and then some key growth drivers and inhibitors. I'll go very quickly through these slides. We will have a few printouts for honourable members, and as I said, the full report is available as well. So these were just the members that were surveyed, all our TV members, our radio members, and signal providers. I've got to always underscore that, of course, we don't represent all 200-odd community broadcasters. This is the NAB membership that participates in the survey, and it's the majority of, obviously, all the public and the commercial as well. Looking back, we just look at audiences and audience growth from 2018. We can see that there's been a slight reduction if we look forward into 2023-24, and I think that has a lot to do also with where people are consuming content. People are consuming, especially those who are advantaged enough on your handhelds. I'm sure all of you are busy consuming content on your handhelds as well. The nice, interesting stat as well is if we look at the growth in terms of the number of stations. If we look at 2014 from 38 TV and 217 per radio. If we look at 2023, 41 TV, 293. And I think ICASA has done a sterling job, and this really shows how the sector has grown despite these harsh economic conditions. This is just how we're listening to radio. I think we're also listening through traditional mediums. Of course, car radio still persists, still very strong way in which we are consuming. But we are consuming online, we're streaming, we're consuming through cell phones, etc. And this just gives us a track of where people are listening and how they're listening. I think when you look at the revenue side of things, we can definitely see the COVID period, the 2020, 21, 22, those dips, and the industry is now beginning to rebound. If we look back just at television revenues have kind of leveled out almost, but have dropped in 2023. Contributions, however, to taxes, levies, and license fees, and that's in millions. 2019, 3.8 billion. 2023, 2.6 billion. Again, all of this really does relate back to the economy and to how we've been progressing. Similarly for radio, also just the numbers from 2019 to 2023, 2019 at almost around 4 billion, 2023, 24, 3.4. In terms of contributions to license fees, levies, fees, etc., radio contributions in the last cycle was 673 million. Prior years, 644. Overall, I think what we also try to track with our members is just how we're doing in terms of employment. And there has been a little bit of a decline in terms of permanent employment. There's also been a decline in terms of contractors and freelancers. But we are very pleased to see that we're also tracking employment of people with disabilities. On the investment side, investment over the last 5 years, 780 million on infrastructure, and 62 million on research and development. On corporate social responsibility investments, more than 1,700 projects with a value of over 1.7 billion. So in terms of overall employment, again, I've got to stress this is our members' survey. 58% of our members have women employees. The stat that does worry us all is what we need to do for young people. And right now we're sitting at a stat of 26%. And by young people, Madam Chairperson, we looked at 35 and under. I know we're very youthful in our 60s, but this is what we looked at. Overall investment, and I think again we've exceeded all regulations, all requirements. 46% on the TV side is Black Economic Empowered, and on the radio side 55%. A local content investment, and I think that the entire industry should be extremely proud of this investment, as well as the regulator for the enabling framework around that. If we look at the investment in the 2020 to 21 period, it was 5.6 billion. 2022-23, 10.3 billion. ICASA also does their annual State of the ICT Sector report. They would also look at these numbers and verify. The 2019 to 23 period, 20 billion investment. That also includes content that's done specifically for radio. And we're so wonderful. It's so wonderful to see and hear so many more about kind of radio dramas, radio documentaries, because I think a lot of the time, because we're such a visual medium, we forget just the incredible work happening on the radio side. The load shedding impact has been, really, really harsh on all of us. 144 million, that was in year 2023, compared to 2019, 27.5 million. And that's the point Ainan made around, we're having to get backups for our backups. We're sitting right now, and I don't know what stage we're on load shedding, might be 6, 5, 4, but the lights are on, tech is working, and I think we have to really congratulate the entire sector for always keeping our citizens informed. Then I'm going to hand over to Julia. She's just going to look quickly at a few of the key indicators that our members talk to in terms of how can we move the broadcasting sector forward. We looked at a few industry drivers and inhibitors, and this is both for the television side and the radio. We're really just going to flag a few. As I said, you're going to have the detailed report. Julia, you can just talk to a few of those.
Great, thank you very much. I'll briefly be discussing just some of the highlights of the industry drivers and inhibitors identified in the report that will help move television broadcasting forward. On the red side, you can see that there are two major inhibitors that have been identified in the report that largely overlap. The first has been touched on by my colleagues and will be touched on again by my colleagues. And this is that there is policy and regulatory uncertainty in the broadcasting sector, which needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Secondly, which overlaps with this, is that there are broadcasters that broadcasters are competing with unregulated content platforms. As a result of these two inhibitors, broadcasters are left in a difficult position without clear guidance, which can stifle growth, and without regulatory parity between licensed broadcasters and unlicensed OTT providers. A driver that is pushing the television broadcasting sector forward is technology. Licensed broadcasters in this country are leading the charge for technological development, and this is moving the sector forward to the benefit of all South Africans. In terms of reflections on what could be changed, broadcasters, the report notes that broadcasters are calling for an urgent need for policy regulation and enforcement measures that will enable fair competition and create policy certainty. There is also a need to further strengthen the regulator. In terms of growth opportunities for television broadcasters, as mentioned, there's a lot of growth in the OTT space. And while broadcasters are leaning into this, this further necessitates the need for enhanced regulations to ensure that there is a fair playing field, a level playing field between licensed broadcasters and unregulated OTT providers. For the radio broadcasting sector, in terms of the industry drivers and inhibitors, in terms of major inhibitors, these largely overlap with the television sector. This includes unregulated content providers, competing directly with regulated and licensed broadcasters, and also the lack of policy and regulatory certainty. Similarly, podcast technology and other technologies are driving the sector forward. The report notes that there are certain things that could be changed in the sector. One of these could be includes a review of community media sector to find workable, sustainable strategies for the community media sector. There also needs to be, very similar to TV, there are concerns regarding the unregulated foreign digital players in the radio broadcasting space. And these players need to be regulated. Online content, online podcasts need to be regulated in order to create a level playing field. In terms of possible growth opportunities in the radio broadcasting sector, we would encourage, obviously, that compliant broadcasters be invited to take part in robust regulatory discussions to ensure that not only is there a level playing field, but any policies that are developed as part of these discussions are workable and are future-proof. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chairperson and Honourable Members. So we'll then just be highlighting what can be done to just foster a sustainable and vibrant broadcasting sector. One of the issues that the NAB has been grappling with in the recent past is in relation to the Film and Publication Board, which I'm sure you are well versed with, as it's one of the entities that fall under the DCDT. The FPB is primarily a content regulatory authority, and in 2022 or so, the Film and Publication Act was amended in light of the proliferation of the consumption of online content. And one of the amendments really related to the mandate ultimately of the FPB where it relates to online content, but quite specifically also demarcating the content and entities that do not fall within the purview of the FPB. As mentioned, ICASA is an independent regulator, and therefore all entities that fall under the jurisdiction of ICASA certainly do not fall under the jurisdiction and authority of the FPB. This was well understood until the FPB amendment legislation, and the NAB has been engaging with the FPB because the position that we hold, and also just based on the interpretation of the revised FPB Act, is that licensed broadcasters are exempt in relation to their broadcast platform, but also their streaming and online services. And notwithstanding the fact that we have tried to engage with the FPB to try and come to a common understanding, we have had to institute litigation against the FPB just to ensure that there's a declarator. And this really is also within the context of the broader policy vacuum that we've been speaking to in relation to what would have been the policy certainty brought about by the draft white paper. The draft white paper has been ongoing for some time now, but unfortunately, whilst we were encouraged as a sector that it would address some of the perennial issues, we are sitting almost 5 years later and the draft white paper has not been finalized. And it's quite critical for that process to be fast-tracked, because it will address a lot of the issues that have already been highlighted. Importantly, it will provide that regulatory certainty. As licensed broadcasters, we do compete directly with unlicensed platforms, and it's quite important for us to note that the concern is not only from a competition perspective, but the concern is also the cost of compliance that we incur, and as well as the level of investments that are made by license conditions, which we far exceed vis-a-vis the lack of regulation, so to speak, that the OTTs are operating within, despite the fact that we are trying to garner for the same audiences as well as the same advertising revenue. And portfolio committee members would have noticed that there has been a decrease in the advertising revenue for both radio and TV broadcasters, and that is directly attributable to the fact that OTTs are now attracting a lot of the advertising revenue itself. And so those are some of the things that we just wanted to highlight in relation to why it is quite imperative that the draft white paper is addressed with urgency. Now, one of the things that we've noticed is because we recognize that, of course, a policy process does take quite a long time, and this particular policy process seeks to really be holistic in terms of what is included. We have also previously engaged with the ministry and highlighted in the induction with the portfolio committee what are some of the low-hanging fruits that the portfolio committee can actually adopt or implement to try and ease the burden, whilst we also try and ensure that we do continue and bring the policy process to fruition. And we have proposed legislative amendments to the ECA. And I must emphasize that these legislative amendments are not new, as you would note in terms of one of them, which is the easing of ownership restrictions. There has been a standing recommendation from ICASA in as far back as 2002 that there needs to be a review of, in fact, a complete repeal of the ownership restrictions in terms of which a single licensee cannot own more than 2 FM licenses. The reason that this is important is because we are in an economic climate where it's very difficult to attract investment in the current regime insofar as the ownership restrictions are concerned. And so if we at least allow current entities to be able to acquire more licenses, then that can also assist in attracting investment. It is important to also emphasize that there are other instruments that can actually be used to achieve what the ownership limitations is set out to achieve. We know that plurality of content is quite critical, especially in a diverse country as ours, where we have a plethora of cultures and languages, and one of the objectives of the ownership limitations was to ensure that there is plurality. But of course, if we look at some of the regulatory instruments that ICASA has, it is able to, and does indeed, when issuing licenses, impose various format restrictions to ensure that there is indeed plurality. And so it's quite important that it be understood that whilst we are calling for that easing of restrictions, it's also in recognition of some of the efficient methods that are adopted by the regulator to ensure that there is that media plurality. As mentioned again, looking at the economic climate, one of the other ownership restrictions that we have been requesting as an industry be eased is the limitation on foreign ownership. I think it's quite evident that within the South African economy itself, there is less and less free money, as it were, for us to be able to reinvest in our sector. Because of the rising costs of living, we also think about all of the increased investments that we as broadcasters have been actually putting in the sector from a skills development point of view, from an infrastructure point of view. And so it's quite important that we also create an enabling environment for us as a South African sector to be able to attract foreign investment. And currently there is limitation of 20%, and we have as a sector been requesting that that actually be increased. Now, these recommendations do not come outside of the policy process. Members, portfolio committee members will note that both of these recommendations are in fact aligned with the draft-wide policy. And so members can be assured that even in the event that these were to actually be advanced, they wouldn't in any way detract from what has been, at a principal point of view, agreed upon. The reason we are then highlighting it is because we really bear the brunt, and this has to be attended to with urgency because we have at least identified levers that can be used to try and just ease some of the challenges that we are experiencing as a sector. That then brings us to the conclusion, and we thank you very much. I'll just hand over to Nadia for the concluding remarks, and hopefully we can play the PSA. Thank you.
Hopefully we can play the PSA. I think that another former regulator, who is Colin Dimakatsa, Sheila mentioned the issue around the Competition Authority releasing their report. I think you said today or this week. I think we all have to be paying very close attention to what comes out of that report. You know, when we talk about the broadcasting sector or industry, honourable members, we're talking about a huge ecosystem. We're talking about hundreds of radio stations, quite a number of commercial radio stations, all our TV broadcasters, of course the SABC being the public broadcaster, being the anchor in terms of providing news, information in all our languages, plays an absolutely vital role. But the key message that we're wanting to also convey today is that it's an ecosystem that works complementary to each other as well. Of course, there's huge competitive forces, but it's a system where we all respect, appreciate, and understand the key and vital role that each one plays. So whether you driving in from wherever you're driving in today, or listening to an SABC station, or a local community station, or one of the commercial radio stations, this ecosystem is dynamic, it's vibrant. There is so much we should be celebrating, you know, as we now enter our 31st year of democracy. But as you look at funding models, as you look at how we can continue to have a vibrant and sustainable sector, you need to understand the underlying economic challenges. And I think what's happened so often is we have the conversation just focusing on one part of a very big industry. And our appeal is to look at this as a very big ecosystem. Our appeal is to look very seriously at the framework, policy framework, the regulatory framework. Our appeal is, and we've said this to ICASA chairperson and councillors, our appeal is for an agile and a responsive regulator. Our appeal is also for us to have many more opportunities to engage with honourable members of parliament, to share what it is, you know, the experiences on the ground, what broadcasters go through on the daily, how we keep the lights on, how we keep our creativity, our heritage, our culture, our news, information, communications going, often at extremely challenging and difficult circumstances.